thanks so much, Rory, for coming on and chatting to us.
No problem.
So for anyone watching that doesn't know who Rory is, but I'm sure you do, he's a lecturer in social policy in Maynooth, and he's also written two great books on housing, so Housing Shock and Gaffs, and also just kind of is an expert in everything to do with housing and the crisis in general. So yeah, we kind of the recent piece that you put out, we thought was really interesting, and especially the way it kind of like talks about the whole kind of student experience in the round. So we wanted to kind of ask you, for some of our new followers who mightn't be too familiar and who might be just starting college, can you kind of explain why they're entering into a space where they might have just received their first round offer but they can't find anywhere to live? Like how has it gotten to this state for students?
I was just saying that in terms of, how did we end up here? And for students, it has to be really, really frustrating and really difficult to be in situations where, and we're hearing it, horrific situations of students having to turn down their course, their first preference, because they literally can't find accommodation. And there's even the stress, the huge stress that it causes when it should be a time of celebration, when people are, put in such work for the leaving cert, and then to turn around and there's no sense of, this is a time to, they get offered their course and it's just all panic and stress about accommodation. And it ruins the student experience from the outset. And we know that there are, one of the biggest concerns I have is that students are being pushed into, exploitative situations, and it's probably, it's a hard place to start, but I think it's important when we look at things like the sex for rent scandal that emerged around landlords, that this isn't something that's just flippant, that is something that is, should be brushed off as, oh, well, it's just students, and that's what they have to do, and sure, didn't we all do it? No, it was never as bad as this. This is the worst student accommodation crisis this country has ever seen. And students are being exploited and scammed more so than ever. And this is, and particularly we know, for example, vulnerable students who are coming from abroad, for example, very vulnerable to exploitation. And there is no doubt that there's going to be students exploited because they feel they've no choice but to take offers of accommodation. And we've seen crazy situations where, people have been expected to, or, been offered accommodation on a shared bed basis. This is just horrific stuff. And then, you have students who are commuting huge lengths of distance in terms of having to, if they can't find accommodation immediately, and I spoke about this in the article in the journal, I see those students in my class, they're exhausted. We heard of one student during the week there having to get up at 5 in the morning to try and make a 10 a.m. lecture, and then having to leave at 3 or 4 to arrive back at home at 9 or 10. That's not a student experience. That's not even an educational experience, because the issue now is how students are being, their whole educational experience, the actual attainment of the education. Education, again, it's like this assumption that students just, get on with things and, can live in crappy conditions and be expected to get a third level qualification. But, attending third level requires, reading, exams, study, concentration. It requires you to be at your, the top of your game. And to be able to do that, you have to have a place where you can rest, where you can feel safe, where you can feel, you can study, and these things just aren't available for many, many students. And as kind of, so this is, it is a human crisis. And I think at some level, students are getting lost within the wider housing crisis. And that's very difficult. And it's understandable at some level, because when you look at the levels of homelessness now that we've reached, we look at, lecturers, teachers, guards can't find housing. And so students kind of get lumped down to the bottom. But as I said, that exposes them to, real dangerous situations. And, we saw last year, and we'll probably see it again in terms of students staying in tents. Again, that's completely unsafe. Again, you know, impacting on education, the quality of education, and their own human rights. You know, housing is a basic human right. Accommodation is a right. And, you know, the question then, if for students, for many students, is, you know, how did we end up here? And how is this just being accepted as okay? And we're being told, you know, just figure it out. With, to be honest, very little real support from the government. And it goes back to, as I wrote about in the article, the policy from 6 years ago, which is 2017, the government's national student housing strategy. They had a policy to, because back then it was very, very clear that there was a need for student accommodation. We had seen the shift in Irish society from the mid 2000s onwards, as you know, young people back then, middle-aged people now, were locked out of being able to buy a home because house prices went so high. And then they, you know, increasingly people had to rent and rent for longer. And so in the past, you had students who would have got accommodation in the private rental sector. Now there's much less available because families are there, individuals are there, professionals are there, because they can't buy a home. And so you had this situation growing since then, 6 years ago, of simply, you know, less accommodation been available for students, and that student crisis growing. And their response, policy response, was the same policy response that we've seen in housing policy over the last 10 years. It was, we will let the market do it, and we will use investor funds to do it. And this was the real, now you could call it a policy failure, but it wasn't actually a failure. It was purposeful. The global investor funds, which I talk about in the article and in my books, the likes of Hines, who own Yugo Development, the other kind of investor, a lot of them are UK based and US based private real estate kind of funds that have developed all the new student accommodation. They all, you know, they were heavily lobbying government as well at that time that, you know, they could provide the solution of building new student accommodation. And rather than the government going and researching a bit, okay, what are these guys after? They just said, oh yeah, sure, you know, build away here. Let's give you lots of subsidies, and you know, things like they don't have to build 10% of their housing as social housing. And that's a massive subsidy. That purpose-built student accommodation by these global investor funds, real estate funds, don't have to provide, as all private housing development had to do at that time, 10% of their developments as social housing. The government's, essentially their accommodation strategy was completely based on investor fund, these real estate companies who've built student accommodation. And it was completely based on enticing them in through the various, you know, tax breaks that are available to real estate funds, but also not having to build the affordable social housing element. And we've seen this huge expansion, this, you know, popping up everywhere, these student accommodation blocks, but completely unaffordable, and really just ripping off students, ripping off international students, turned into commodities. And no controls on the rents, the new rents that are being charged in these units. And it is really just shameful to see that, you know, the government knew 6 years ago there was this student accommodation need, and they just handed that need over to these real estate funds and real estate companies rather than building public affordable, you know, funding universities and funding the technological universities as well to build. And I was making the point that the other issue within this was, of course, that the government has completely failed to protect renters and give renters proper rights across the board. And students, a lot of students are renters in the private rental sector. And so they are exposed to this lack of tenant protections. And you know, students came to me last year, we'll hear it again this year, students being evicted. They're very vulnerable in terms of not having licensees, not having proper rights, but also just they are, as renters, very vulnerable to evictions. We've seen record levels of evictions in this country, 20,000 notices to quit served to tenants in the last year, unprecedented numbers of evictions. And that has been about government prioritising the interests of landlords ahead of renters, ahead of younger generations and older generations who are renting, who are reliant on the rental sector for a home. And it has been this treatment in policy of housing as a commodity, as an investment asset, rather than what it should be, which is a home, a place that provides people a secure, safe accommodation. And students are at the bottom of the pile in terms of people who are trying to access accommodation in the rental sector. They're squeezed out, and as I said earlier, squeezed into really deeply exploitative situations. And I'm very, very worried and very concerned and saddened by the stress that students are going to live through in the coming months and are living through, the situations they will have to go through, their education lost as a result. And there's a huge inequality within all of this, because of course it's those who are on lower incomes, from more vulnerable backgrounds, who will lose out the most because they can't afford the accommodation, the huge costs of purpose-built student accommodation. And when we look at it, I think that this government should be doing a number of things. That the first one should be to tackle properly the scale of vacant properties and derelict properties. When we look at, for example, there are 166,000 vacant homes across the country, and yet these are just been left there, and it's an utter scandal. And we look at then the dereliction, we can see it across our towns and cities, buildings just being left empty, not being used. These could be, tackled quickly. The other thing we could be doing very quickly is building factory-built modular housing. There's a factory in the UK, I pointed this out earlier in the year, which builds thousands of homes every year, but it's being closed because the business isn't there. The Irish government, there's no reason why it couldn't purchase that factory and start immediately providing hundreds of modular homes for students rather than them having to live in tents. We're seeing the other big issue, of course, is that issue around tenants' rights. The eviction ban needs to be brought in again. There should be a ban on eviction this winter and extended. We should see proper tenants' rights, proper tenant protections from evictions. Students are going to be evicted this year. We need to see one of the biggest issues that I highlight is this question of what is the government going to do with the budget surplus. 12 billion this year, and they're going to decide not to spend it, to put it off for some rainy day when, as I say, students are literally drowning in a crisis now. We have records levels of homelessness in this country. We've almost 4,000 children who are homeless with their families. 4,000. The fact that one child in this country is homeless would be a scandal, but that we've 4,000 now, it has become normalized. And I see, we need to find our rage, we need to find our anger. And I hope as students that, you don't accept this, that you do stand up. And I know you are, and organising, because we can't accept this as a society. And this question of the surplus of the 12 billion, I think, is key, because we should be asking, why are they putting 12 billion away to future pensions, to pay off the national debt, when it should be used to set up a public construction company that would hire workers to build homes, that would fund universities and technical universities to build student accommodation now. And I hope we see massive protests in the run up to this budget, and civil society and students demanding that this money is put into housing, because the government's it's not putting it into housing. That 12 billion is 3 times, almost 4 times when you take out certain spending on things like HAP, what is spent every year on housing. It could be transformative. The other area that I make the case is that housing is a human right, that we've made a massive mistake in this country allowing housing become this investment asset that benefits a few people, landlords, developers, investor funds, and that we don't treat it as a human right. And I think the fundamental change is needed. that our housing system, the derelict properties, the vacant properties, the rental properties that are available, that we say that this housing, the land that we have, the huge land that we have that could be building affordable homes, that is used for affordable homes and not investment assets. And I think to do that, we need to make housing a human right. Your generation and many people in this country were very central to making massive social change around marriage equality and marriage equality and repeal, to very important movements that were driven by ordinary people saying we've had enough. And I think we need to do the same on housing. We need to have a form of civil society uprising that says, no, we're not accepting this. I just can't get my head around how the level of trauma that has been caused by this housing crisis, the level of stress, anxiety, hundreds of thousands of people's lives being ruined, destroyed, and they contact me every day, and yet it's just accepted. And of course, so many people are living it. They feel powerless, but we do have a power. If we come together, we have a power to say, no, we're not accepting this. And I think we need to have a referendum to put a human right, housing as a human right, into the Constitution, to really force governments to make those changes.
But yeah, just one kind of thing that's always kind of thrown back at us when we meet with ministers and other kind of politicians about trying to bring in like greater protection, like for students in digs and just students in general renting in the rental sector. And it's the whole thing about, oh, supply, there's going to be no supply, no one's going to run to rent a room to a student, in particular in digs, because there's going to be too much bureaucracy. They're going to have to jump through all these hoops, even though the government is giving them 14,000 tax-free. But like, that's something we see, and that argument is always put against us, that all the landlords are leaving the market. We can't do anything, we can't put any protections in place because everyone's just going to leave, and then there's going to be nothing left for anyone. But yeah, that's my thoughts.
Yeah, the point was made the same around the eviction ban. They said they couldn't put back in place the eviction ban because all the landlords were leaving. And my view on this is really just bending to the landlord lobby. It's the landlord lobby, the property association, property owners association, who say all these landlords are leaving because there's too much tenants' rights in place. We know that a lot of landlords are leaving because simply they're getting so old they want to sell their property. We know that landlords are leaving because they bought the property as an investment asset. Housing prices now have reached the height they're going to reach, and so they're selling their investment asset. This is what they do. And the issue should be that we need to do as other countries have, proper protection for tenants. So you can't be evicted when the landlord sells the property. It's as simple as straightforward that, and because it's a never-ending vicious cycle that, we can't put in place protections for tenants because the landlords will leave. So there's never a point comes when you put in place proper protections for tenants. And I think that I don't believe that all the landlords are leaving because of this. And the other issue is in response to that, well, if they are leaving because they don't want to put in place proper tenant protections, well, then the state should buy them. They shouldn't be a landlord if they're not willing to give tenants proper rights and proper protections. And I think that argument is there. The question of the digs is different because that's a different question. But I think the evidence on landlords leaving, actually the census figures showed that we actually had an increase in private rental tenancies between 2016 and 2022, and that we have 50,000 more renters than are officially registered with the Residential Tenancies Board, which shows that a lot of landlords aren't actually registering. And so I don't buy that argument, and I think it's a dangerous, it's the argument that's being spun, and I think it benefits landlords to the detriment of tenants. And the question of supply, the supply has to come from government building affordable housing. I think if we rely on the supply coming from landlords, then there's never a point at which you say we can put in place proper tenant protections.
We've got another question here, and it's, what does Rory think about the apathy of nothing can be done, and does he think we can address it? So what kind of can be done, and kind of people say towards.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. There's always people who are apathetic and who don't want to do things and don't feel things can be done. But I do feel that there is a lot of sense of people feeling that they can't do anything. It's not that there's apathy, that it's a sense of disempowerment. And I do think we need to say to people that that you do have a power, that you can change things, that things change all the time in society, and the reason why they're not changing to benefit renters or younger generations is because the people who are influencing power at the moment are the landlords, investors, developers, multiple property owners. And so you need to use the power that you have, which is the power of protest and the power of standing up. And that is a power you have. And on social media, there's lots of ways to use that power to stand up and say, this isn't okay. So you do have a power. And it is, I think, about using it because people feel disempowered. And the other thing is people feel really that there isn't an alternative way of doing this, that it's just the way it is. And I think that's so important to highlight and show them there are solutions and there are other ways of doing this. There are other countries, as was mentioned from someone there, that, like Finland, who don't have homelessness like we have. Who, many countries like Denmark, they don't have homelessness. They don't have the amount of, young people. Just 12% of their young adults are living at home. Here, it's 2/3. They have very different approaches to housing, very different understandings of housing. So it can be different. So hopefully that would motivate them and get them involved. And if not, just tell them you won't be their friend if they're not involved.
So another question about how the situation is so if someone is living at home and they're living at home for years, oh yeah, it's because my mic is on, sorry. Is there any chance for someone who's living at home, we'll say now in their 30s, and they want to move out at some stage, but like when is the housing crisis going to be fixed? Big question.
When is the housing crisis going to be fixed? I think when we put in place the proper policies to fix it. I think that, if you're in your 30s now and living at home, it's very, very difficult. And I would hope, and I've said this, that with the proper policies and with emergency action, we could deliver, I think close to twice the number of homes we are each year. If you had the proper policies, I think within 2 to 3 years, definitely within a 5-year time frame, you could have a major progress made. And in a situation where people really see, we can access housing, again, as I pointed out, the vacant housing, using modular housing, modular factory building housing, we could do this, but it requires politicians, government who want to actually really go out and do it and not be just relying on the private developers. And because I think that is the problem. It's still, we're overly reliant on the market. And again, I think, I do put it back to people. I talk about this in my book as well, that there are things we can do. There are, organizations like, they're called housing associations, which are not for profit, housing bodies that deliver housing. If there's vacant land around you or you see vacant buildings, you can contact them, the likes of, they're called Cluid or Respond or the Coulon Housing, and say, look, there's land there, there's housing, could you build on it? Similar, contact the local authority and say the council and say, why is this not being built on? We know that there's initiatives now in places like Mayo County Council. Hopefully it's been rolled out, where if you see a vacant property and you're interested in buying it, or it's something been done, you can contact the council and see who owns it. The other thing is cooperatives. I know down in Cork, for example, in UCC, there's a student cooperative, which is people coming together and trying to self-develop housing. I think that's a real way forward as well. People squat as well. They squat buildings. There's a question of highlighting vacant land and going, why isn't it been used, vacant buildings as well? There is a real, I think there's a real sense that kind of that people who are affected by the housing crisis, I think really, need to come together, as we've seen in some protests, but they need to be bigger, and people need to stand up and are doing things. The like of CATU, the tenants union, for example, as well, is a very important place for people to get involved with, and they meet other people who are facing a similar situation and get organised. And obviously we've local elections coming up, a general election coming up definitely has to be within the next year and a half. So there are big possibilities for major change. Hopefully young people and not so young people who are affected by the housing crisis will really use their voice to push for change.
Yeah, so like if there was one kind of policy change to focus in on, and to because obviously it's a massive crisis and it's a bit overwhelming to think of all the things that we could be doing. If there's one thing we'll say that the student movement could focus on for the year, and to push for something that's kind of not that can be achieved within a year, but something kind of more manageable to set us in the right direction.
Yeah, it's a difficult one because there are so many aspects to it. I make the point, I think there's two things. One, as I've said earlier, is really the budget. I think the budget is key, and I would think it's a key moment, but I think through the year you should keep pushing on it, which is, I think the housing budget, so that's the amount of money that's put into housing, should be doubled. We're spending about 4 billion, as I said earlier. I think that should be 8 billion. I think, a very specific thing that could be argued is, I'm arguing for 8 billion, but at least an extra 4 billion from that fund, the surplus, should go directly into housing. And I think it should set up a public construction company, a national building agency. I really think that's fundamental to really roll out the delivery of affordable public housing. I think that's key. The other one is the right to housing. I think the right to housing, making housing a human right, putting in a constitution, that would, we're not seeing real progress on that yet. And I think that they would be two things that would really make a difference. And as people are saying in the chat there as well, join your union. Oh, absolutely. The students' union, get involved in the students' union, get involved in your trade union, get involved in CATU. And that's the other thing that you can have a big influence on. Protests make a difference. We've seen that. I always point out, the IFA and the farmers, block the M50, and that gets them attention. And we need to, the people who aren't farmers in this country need to find their voice. People affected by the housing crisis need to find their voice and block the M50.
So on the 7th of October, there's going to be the Cost of Living Coalition, a major protest. I imagine Raise the Roof is going to be doing some protests soon. And then also I think USI, so the Union of Students in Ireland, are also planning a budget protest kind of for the start of October. So if you keep an eye kind of on them, I'm sure there's other protests, but those are the ones I can think of at the moment. Yeah, and then we had another question asking so Rory, if you're in favour of a vacancy tax, so your opinion on radical ideas like tax on empty bedrooms.
Yeah, we do now have a vacant property tax, but the problem is that it is self-reported and self-declared. You have to declare yourself. It's to revenue, and it's quite low. It's very, very low. I don't think it's significant, and it also doesn't include derelict properties. But there is the local authorities, the councils, can actually implement fines on derelict properties and move to compulsory purchase them. And I think that's what should be done. They should be compulsory purchase. There's other ideas things called compulsory sales orders that would be that we should introduce, so that vacant and derelict buildings should be forced to be sold. They cannot be allowed to sit there. The question of the bedroom tax, the vacant, I think that's different, because that is generally in people's homes, and I think that's different than a vacant property tax that is a whole property that's a second or third property owned by someone that's sitting vacant. I think the vacant home bedroom tax is a very difficult one, because it's very difficult to assess, why is a bedroom empty, and is it empty simply, for different reasons, and it's someone's home. And I would be much more in favor of taxing multiple properties that are owned, second, third, fourth, vacant, and land as well, much, much more radically.
It's coming up to 8 o'clock now, so unless anyone has any final questions, I might let Rory go just because we've taken up a lot of his time already. Um, but yeah, so thanks very much for coming along and joining and chatting to us about this. It's been very interesting. It's certainly given me lots of ideas of what things you can do in the union this year. So hopefully it's given others that were listening as well. And we'll save this and we'll put it up on our page as well so people can watch back at another time. There we go, Roisin, hero of housing. There you go.
Thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to talk, and it's great to see student unions doing this, and it is, I do have a sense that things are changing, in the sense that people who are being affected by the housing crisis, and a lot of people in this country do see the need for major change on it, and are just ready and see what needs to be done. And I think the government is completely out of step with that. But so I get hope from things like this. So it's great, and energy. So thank you so much for inviting me.